Hello and welcome to Dreamtime History. Imagine standing at dusk on a silent plain along the Mississippi River, wind drifting through tall grasses where once a great city stood. You sense something beneath your feet, earthen mounds rising from the floodplain like sleeping giants. This is all that remains of what was once the largest city in North America, a forgotten American empire that thrived for centuries in the heartland of what would become the United States. Here, near modern St. Louis, 20,000 people once lived in a metropolis that dwarfed London or Paris of its time. They built massive earthen pyramids, planned great plazas, and created a civilization of stunning complexity. They called their city by a name we have lost to time. We know it only as Cahokia, borrowed from a later tribe that found these silent mounds centuries after the city died. But what happened to this remarkable civilization? How did such a thriving empire simply vanish without a trace? And why does their story remain so deeply hidden from our collective memory? But before we begin our journey, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So, I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. You must begin with the rivers, always with the rivers. For it is here, in the vast embrace of three great waterways, that our story truly starts, not with the first human footstep on this rich earth, but with the patient work of countless floods that built the stage upon which a great civilization would one day rise. Picture yourself standing where the Missouri River surrenders its muddy burden to the Mississippi, where the Illinois adds its own tribute to this continental artery. This is the American Bottom, a name that speaks of geography rather than politics, a fertile floodplain stretching for miles along the eastern bank of the Mississippi, just south of where the city of St. Louis would someday stand. The land here lies low and welcoming, a gift from 10,000 years of spring floods that deposited layer upon layer of rich alluvial soil, creating some of the most fertile earth on the continent. In the dim centuries around 600 of the Common Era, when Europe was struggling through its so-called Dark Ages, this river confluence already pulsed with quiet human activity. Small bands of hunters and gatherers moved through these woodlands and wetlands according to ancient rhythms, following the migrations of waterfowl, the spawning runs of fish, the seasonal abundance of nuts and wild plants. They were the inheritors of what archaeologists call the late woodland tradition, people who had learned to read the subtle signs of this landscape, where the best clay lay hidden beneath the surface, which stands of oak would yield the sweetest acorns, how the river's moods shifted with the seasons. These early inhabitants built temporary camps and modest villages, leaving behind little more than scattered pottery shards and the charcoal stains of long cold fires. Yet they were already beginning to experiment with something that would transform this landscape forever: the deliberate cultivation of plants. Not the intensive agriculture that would later support vast cities, but something quieter, more tentative. They encouraged the growth of native seed plants like goosefoot and marsh elder, learning to save the best seeds, to clear small patches of ground, to work with the land's natural abundance rather than against it. But the true revolution came from the south, travelling slowly up the great river highways in the hands of traders and migrants. Maize, what we commonly call corn, had been domesticated thousands of years earlier in the highlands of Mexico, and over the centuries it had gradually spread northward, adapting to new climates and growing seasons. By the 8th and 9th centuries, improved varieties of this remarkable grain were finding their way into the American Bottom, along with two companions that would prove equally transformative: beans and squash. This trinity of crops, which indigenous peoples would later call the Three Sisters, represented nothing less than an agricultural revolution. Maize provided carbohydrates and could be dried for winter storage. Beans contributed essential proteins and, through their root bacteria, actually enriched the soil with nitrogen. Squash offered vitamins and minerals, while its broad leaves helped retain soil moisture and suppress weeds. Together they could support far larger populations than hunting and gathering alone, and they did so reliably, year after year. The transformation did not happen overnight. For generations, the cultivation of these crops remained a supplement to hunting, fishing, and gathering wild foods. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the balance shifted. Villages grew larger and more permanent. Storage pits appeared, deep bell-shaped excavations lined with grass or bark where surplus grain could be kept through the winter months. the seasonal round of activities began to centre more and more around the agricultural calendar. The careful timing of planting, the vigilant tending of growing crops, the communal labour of harvest time. By the 9th and 10th centuries, something remarkable was taking shape in the American bottom. The small, scattered camps of earlier times were coalescing into substantial settlements. Villages that had once housed a few dozen people now supported hundreds. More importantly, these communities were becoming year-round affairs, anchored to the land by their investment in cleared fields and storage facilities. The fertile floodplain could support this intensification. The annual spring floods, which had once been seen as obstacles to overcome, now became welcomed events that renewed the soil's fertility and provided natural irrigation for the growing crops. The forests offered timber for construction and fuel, as well as continued hunting opportunities. The rivers and wetlands teemed with fish, waterfowl, and other resources that supplemented the agricultural bounty. Yet this was more than simply a story of increasing numbers or improved technology. As communities grew larger and more stable, new forms of social organisation began to emerge. The coordination required for large-scale agricultural activities, clearing land, planting vast fields, organising labour for harvest, demanded new kinds of leadership and cooperation. Evidence from this period suggests the beginning of social differentiation, with some individuals or families achieving higher status, perhaps through their roles as organisers of communal work or keepers of agricultural knowledge. The pottery styles of this era reflect these changing social dynamics. Where earlier ceramics had been largely utilitarian and locally made, the vessels from these emerging agricultural settlements show increasing standardization and sophistication. This suggests not only growing craft specialization, but also expanding networks of contact and exchange between communities spread across the river valleys. As the first millennium of the Common Era drew to a close, the stage was set for something unprecedented in the history of North America. The confluence of rivers, the gift of fertile soil, the revolutionary power of intensive agriculture, and the emerging bonds of community organization had created the perfect conditions for urban civilization to bloom in the heart of the continent. The scattered seeds of what would become the greatest city north of Mexico had already been planted in this rich earth, waiting for the right moment to flourish. In the decades that followed the agricultural revolution, something subtle yet profound began to reshape the human geography of the American bottom. Like iron filings drawn to a magnet, the scattered communities of the river valleys found themselves pulled toward a single point in the landscape, a modest rise of land just east of the Mississippi, where the floodplain offered its most stable and fertile ground. This convergence was not the result of conquest or coercion, but rather the slow, almost organic response to forces that operated below the level of conscious decision-making. Imagine yourself as a traveller in those distant centuries, moving along the well-worn paths that connected village to village across hundreds of miles of river valley. You would have noticed, perhaps without fully understanding why, that these trails were beginning to bend toward a common destination. Footpaths that had once linked communities in simple networks were now converging like the spokes of a great wheel, all pointing toward the same fertile rise of ground where the largest and most prosperous settlement was taking shape. The reasons for this convergence were as complex as they were compelling. At the most practical level, the site possessed geographic advantages that became increasingly valuable as trade networks expanded. It sat at the heart of the continent's greatest river system, where goods and people could move with relative ease in any direction, north along the Mississippi toward the Great Lakes, south toward the Gulf of Mexico, east along the Missouri toward the vast grasslands, or west along the Illinois toward the Atlantic watersheds. But geography alone cannot explain why this particular spot became a magnet for human activity. More important was its growing reputation as a place where extraordinary things could be obtained, not just the everyday necessities of life, but exotic materials and finished goods that spoke of connections to distant worlds. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a remarkable expansion in the variety and geographic origin of trade goods flowing through the emerging centre. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast began appearing in increasing quantities, their iridescent surfaces transformed by skilled artisans into gorgets, beads, and ceremonial ornaments. Copper from the Great Lakes region, that magical metal that could be hammered into sheets or drawn into wire without breaking, found its way into the workshops of local craftsmen. High-quality stone for tool-making, chert from distant quarries, Obsidian from volcanic regions far to the west arrived in quantities that suggest not occasional trading expeditions, but regular, sustained contact with suppliers hundreds of miles away. These exotic goods did more than simply enhance daily life. They transformed the social dynamics of the communities that possessed them. A person adorned with copper ornaments and marine shell jewellery was making a statement about their connections, their status, their ability to participate in networks that stretched far beyond the local village. The possession and display of such goods became markers of prestige and social position, creating new forms of hierarchy and new reasons for people to gravitate toward the places where such treasures could be acquired. The pottery of this period tells a particularly revealing story about the social changes taking place. Where earlier ceramics had been distinctly local in style, each village or region maintaining its own traditions of form, decoration and technique, vessels from the emerging central site began to show increasing standardization. This was not the rigid uniformity of mass production, but rather the subtle convergence of styles that occurs when craftspeople from different traditions begin working side by side, learning from one another and developing new shared aesthetic standards. More significantly, the pottery reveals evidence of expanding production scales. Instead of each household making its own vessels as needed, specialized potters were now creating ceramics in quantities that suggest they were producing for trade and exchange rather than purely domestic use. The clay itself tells stories of long-distance connections, with tempering materials and mineral inclusions that reveal vessels made in distant locations and transported to the central site, as well as local products destined for communities scattered across the river valleys. Religious and ceremonial life also began to coalesce around the emerging centre. While we must be cautious about interpreting the spiritual beliefs of a people who left no written records, the material evidence suggests that certain rituals and practices were becoming standardized across the region. Burial customs, which had previously varied considerably from community to community, began to show striking similarities. The positioning of bodies, the types of grave goods included, the selection of burial locations, all of these practices were becoming more uniform, suggesting the spread of shared religious ideas or the influence of a central ceremonial authority. Perhaps most importantly, the site was developing a reputation as a place where community decisions were made and disputes resolved. As trade networks expanded and interactions between distant communities became more frequent and complex, the need for neutral meeting grounds and recognized authorities became increasingly apparent. The emerging central settlement, with its growing population, its accumulation of exotic goods, and its strategic location, naturally evolved into such a meeting place. You can imagine the seasonal gatherings that must have taken place during these formative centuries, great assemblies where people from dozens of communities would converge to trade goods, arrange marriages, settle disputes, and participate in ceremonies that reinforced their shared identity as members of a larger cultural system. These gatherings would have been times of intense social activity, when news and innovation spread rapidly through the assembled crowds, when new alliances were forged and old ones renewed. The demographic effects of this convergence were dramatic. Where the site had once supported a few hundred inhabitants, it now housed several thousand. But more importantly, the composition of the population was changing. No longer was this simply a farming community whose members had lived in the same location for generations. It was becoming a cosmopolitan centre that attracted immigrants from across the river valleys, craft specialists, traders, ritual leaders, and ambitious individuals seeking opportunities that could not be found in smaller communities. This demographic transformation created its own momentum. As the settlement grew larger and more diverse, it became even more attractive to new migrants, who were drawn by the economic opportunities, the social connections, and the sheer excitement of living in a place where momentous changes were taking place. The slow accumulation of people, goods, and ideas was building towards something unprecedented in the history of North America, a true urban centre that would soon dwarf anything the continent had ever seen. The transformation from convergence to monumentality did not happen suddenly, like the striking of a match in darkness. Instead, it emerged slowly from the accumulated momentum of communal life, as natural and inevitable as water finding its way downhill. Somewhere in the 9th and 10th centuries of the Common Era, the growing community at the heart of the American bottom began to express its collective identity in a new and profound way, through the deliberate reshaping of the earth itself. The first mounds were modest affairs, scarcely more than low-rises in the landscape, where important buildings once stood or significant ceremonies had taken place. But they represented something revolutionary in human organisation, the willingness of hundreds, and eventually thousands, of people to invest their collective labour in projects that served no immediate practical purpose. These were not fortifications built in response to military threat, nor storage facilities created to house surplus goods. They were statements carved in earth and clay, declarations of permanence and shared purpose that would outlast the lives of those who built them. To understand the magnitude of what was taking place, you must imagine the logistics involved in even the smallest of these early earthworks. Each basket load of soil had to be dug from designated borrow pits, carried by human hands across sometimes considerable distances, and deposited with careful attention to the intended shape and slope of the growing mound. There were no beasts of burden, no wheeled vehicles, no mechanical aids of any kind, only the patient accumulation of human effort, basket by basket, day by day, season by season. The labour was communal in the truest sense, involving not just the able-bodied adults of the community, but entire families working together across generational lines. Children too young for heavy lifting could help by preparing the clay and grass that would be mixed with soil to create stable earthwork, while elderly members of the community contributed their knowledge of construction techniques and their authority in organising work crews. The mounds thus became repositories of more than just earth. They contained the collective investment of entire communities in a shared vision of their future. But the most remarkable aspect of these early earthworks was not their scale, impressive though it was, but their careful integration into a larger conception of sacred geography. The builders were not randomly piling up earth wherever convenient. They were creating a deliberate arrangement of spaces and structures that reflected sophisticated understanding of orientation, proportion, and symbolic meaning. The mounds were positioned with careful attention to astronomical alignments, their axes oriented to capture the rising and setting points of the sun at significant times of the year. The earliest, ceremonial complex seems to have been organised around a great plaza, a vast open space kept clear of permanent structures and maintained as a gathering place for the entire community. This plaza was not simply empty ground, but a carefully engineered landscape, levelled and graded to proper drainage, bordered by earthworks that defined its boundaries and created amphitheatre-like seating areas for observers of whatever ceremonies took place in the central space. Around this plaza, the first generation of mounds began to rise. Some served as platforms for important buildings, structures that archaeologists believe may have housed community leaders, served as temples for religious ceremonies, or functioned as meeting halls for collective decision-making. Others appear to have been burial mounds, though their content suggests these were not simple graveyards, but carefully orchestrated ceremonial spaces where the interment of the dead served larger purposes of community identity and social cohesion. The construction of these mounds required not just physical labour, but remarkable organisational sophistication. Work had to be coordinated across seasons and years, with careful attention to the stability of the earthworks as they grew in height and complexity. The builders developed techniques for creating internal drainage systems that would prevent the mounds from eroding or collapsing during heavy rains. They learned to alternate layers of different soil types to create stable foundations that could support substantial wooden structures on their summits. More challenging still was the social coordination required to sustain such projects over the extended periods necessary for their completion. The largest of the early mounds took decades to build, meaning that their construction spanned multiple generations. This required not only continuity of purpose but sophisticated systems for passing knowledge and authority from one generation to the next. The very act of building the mounds thus helped to create and reinforce the social institutions necessary to sustain them. As the mound-building tradition gained momentum, the spatial organisation of the settlement began to reflect increasingly sophisticated urban planning principles. The placement of mounds was coordinated to create sight lines and ceremonial pathways that connected different areas of the growing city. Residential areas were organised in relation to the ceremonial core, with evidence suggesting that proximity to the Great Plaza and its associated mounds conferred social status and political influence. The earthworks also served practical functions that enhanced their symbolic importance. The elevated platforms provided protection from seasonal flooding, ensuring that the most important buildings and ceremonies would not be disrupted by the spring rise of the rivers. The mounds created artificial hills in the otherwise flat landscape, providing vantage points from which leaders could observe and communicate with the broader community, and from which the community could witness important ceremonies and announcements. Perhaps most significantly, the mounds represented a new relationship between the community and the landscape they inhabited. Rather than simply adapting to the natural contours of the land, the builders were now actively reshaping it to serve their social and spiritual needs. This was not environmental domination in the modern sense, but rather a kind of collaboration with the earth itself, using natural materials and working with natural drainage patterns and soil conditions to create something that enhanced rather than disrupted the local ecosystem. The psychological impact of this transformation must have been profound. Community members who had grown up in modest villages of wooden houses and garden plots were now living in a landscape increasingly dominated by monumental earthworks that dwarfed human scale. These structures served as constant reminders of the community's collective power and permanence, visible symbols of their ability to undertake projects that transcended individual lifespans and immediate needs. Between the years 1000 and 1100 of the Common Era, something extraordinary happened in the heart of North America. What had begun as a modest agricultural settlement, grown into a regional gathering place, and evolved into a ceremonial centre, now exploded into something unprecedented on the continent, a true metropolis that would have been instantly recognizable to a visitor from the great cities of medieval Europe or the Islamic world as a place of genuine urban sophistication. The transformation was breathtaking in its scope and speed. Within the span of perhaps 3 or 4 generations, the population swelled from a few thousand inhabitants to somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 souls, numbers that seem modest by modern standards, but represented the largest concentration of people north of the great cities of Mexico. To put this in perspective, Cahokia at its peak was larger than London would be for several more centuries, more populous than Paris, rivaling the greatest urban centres of its time anywhere in the world. But raw numbers alone cannot convey the magnitude of this transformation. Imagine yourself approaching the city for the first time during these peak decades, travelling along one of the well-worn paths that now converged on the site from every direction, like the threads of a vast spider's web. Long before you reached the urban core, you would have encountered the outer neighbourhoods, clusters of houses and workshops that stretched for miles along the fertile terraces above the floodplain, each community a small town in its own right, yet clearly connected to and dependent upon the great central place that drew you forward. The residential areas spread across roughly 5 to 6 square miles of the American bottom, a vast urban landscape that encompassed not just the ceremonial core with its great mounds and plazas, but dozens of distinct neighbourhoods, each with its own character and function. Some areas specialised in particular crafts, districts where the sound of stone knapping echoed from dawn to dusk as toolmakers shaped implements from exotic cherts, or quarters where the acrid smoke of pottery kilns never quite cleared from the air. Others were primarily residential, dense clusters of family compounds where children played in the narrow spaces between houses and the elderly gathered in the shade to share news and gossip. Walking through these neighbourhoods, you would have been struck by the incredible diversity of the population. This was no longer a community of farmers who had lived in the same place for generations, sharing common ancestry and cultural traditions. Instead, Cahokia had become a cosmopolitan melting pot that drew people from across the vast river systems of the continental interior. You might hear fragments of conversation in half a dozen different languages or dialects, observe pottery styles and house construction techniques from regions hundreds of miles apart, witness burial customs and religious practices that blended traditions from across the Mississippian world. The economic life of the city pulsed with an energy that would have been familiar to merchants in Cairo or Constantinople. The great plaza that formed the ceremonial heart of the settlement doubled as a marketplace where goods from across the continent changed hands in complex networks of exchange. Marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico gleamed in the morning sun beside copper ornaments from the Great Lakes region. Exotic stones for tool-making sat in carefully sorted piles next to bundles of medicinal plants gathered from distant prairies and forests. Skilled craftsmen worked in temporary stalls, transforming raw materials into finished goods, while potential customers watched and negotiated. Yet this was not commerce, as we might understand it today. The exchange of goods was embedded in elaborate social relationships, ceremonial obligations, and kinship networks that extended far beyond the simple calculation of material value. A person acquiring a beautifully carved shell gorget was not simply purchasing jewellery, but participating in a complex web of social relationships that might involve marriage alliances, political obligations, and religious commitments that would bind them to communities scattered across thousands of miles. The sheer logistics of supporting such a large population required innovations in urban planning and resource management that represented genuine advances in the art of civilization. The city needed constant supplies of food, fresh water, fuel for cooking and heating, raw materials for construction and craft production, and systems for managing the waste products of dense human habitation. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Cahokians developed sophisticated solutions to all of these challenges. Agricultural production was intensified and systematized on a scale never before seen in North America. The fertile floodplain for miles around the city was transformed into a carefully managed landscape of fields, gardens, and storage facilities. Maize, beans, and squash were cultivated in vast plots that required coordinated labor for planting, tending, and harvesting. Wild resources were harvested with similar efficiency. Seasonal expeditions to gather nuts, berries, and medicinal plants, coordinated hunting parties that could bring down large quantities of deer and elk, fishing operations that took advantage of seasonal runs of spawning fish. The residential areas themselves were marvels of efficient land use. Houses were built close together to conserve space, yet arranged to provide adequate privacy and access to shared facilities like storage pits and craft workshops. Neighborhoods were connected by a network of paths and small plazas that facilitated movement and social interaction while maintaining distinct community identities within the larger urban fabric. Water management was particularly sophisticated. The city needed reliable access to fresh water for drinking, cooking, and craft activities, but it also had to cope with the seasonal flooding that was an inevitable part of life in the Mississippi floodplain. The inhabitants developed systems of drainage ditches, elevated walkways, and carefully positioned wells that ensured adequate water supplies while minimizing flood damage to homes and storage facilities. The social energy generated by bringing so many people together in such close proximity created its own momentum. Ideas spread rapidly through the dense population, spurring innovations in technology, art, and social organization. Craft specialists could focus their efforts on particular skills, knowing that they could exchange their products for the necessities of life produced by others. Religious and ceremonial life became more elaborate and sophisticated as larger audiences and more diverse participants demanded increasingly impressive performances and displays. At the heart of this great metropolis, rising from the carefully levelled expanse of the Grand Plaza like a mountain conjured from human will, stood the most extraordinary monument ever constructed north of Mexico. Today we call it Monk's Mound, a name borrowed from the French Trappist monks who once farmed its slopes in the 19th century. But to the people who built it, this colossal earthwork represented something far more profound than its modern designation suggests. It was the axis around which their entire world turned, the physical manifestation of their society's highest aspirations and deepest beliefs. To truly comprehend the magnitude of this achievement, you must first imagine the plaza that stretched before it, a vast rectangular space covering more than 40 acres, larger than 20 football fields laid end to end. This was not simply empty ground, but a carefully engineered landscape, levelled and graded with mathematical precision, drained by subtle channels that carried away the seasonal rains, bordered by smaller mounds that created natural amphitheatre seating for the thousands who gathered here for ceremonies, markets, games, and the countless public events that formed the heartbeat of urban life. Standing at the southern edge of this great plaza, perhaps on one of the smaller ceremonial mounds that defined its borders, you would have gazed northward across the flat expanse toward the base of the Great Pyramid. Even from this distance, the monument would have dominated your field of vision, its carefully terraced slopes rising step by step toward a summit that seemed to pierce the very dome of the sky. The mound was not a simple pile of earth, but a sophisticated architectural achievement, its four sides oriented precisely to the cardinal directions, its terraces designed to create distinct levels that served both practical and symbolic functions. The construction of Monk's Mound represents one of the most remarkable feats of engineering and organization in pre-Columbian North America. The finished monument covers approximately 15 acres at its base, an area larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza, and rises to a height of 100 feet above the surrounding floodplain. Modern calculations suggest that its construction required the movement of more than 22 million cubic feet of earth, all carried in baskets on human backs from carefully selected borrow pits scattered across the landscape. But these numbers, impressive as they are, cannot convey the true achievement represented by this monument. The earth was not simply dumped in random piles and shaped into the desired form. Instead, the builders employed sophisticated construction techniques that revealed deep understanding of engineering principles. The mound was built in distinct stages over a period of several decades, with each phase carefully planned to ensure structural stability and proper drainage. Different types of soil were used for different purposes: clay-rich earth for water-resistant outer layers, sandy loam for internal fill, carefully selected materials for the critical foundation layers that would bear the weight of the entire structure. The construction process itself must have been a marvel of social coordination. Work crews had to be organized, supervised, and sustained over periods of years and decades. The borrow pits had to be excavated in locations that would not interfere with agricultural activities or residential areas. The earth had to be transported along carefully planned routes that could accommodate the constant traffic of workers carrying heavy loads. Most remarkably, the entire project had to be coordinated with the normal rhythms of community life: planting and harvest seasons, ceremonial obligations, the demands of daily survival in an urban environment. Imagine yourself making the ascent of this Great Pyramid during its period of active use, climbing the carefully graded pathways that spiraled around its terraced slopes. The journey to the summit would have been both a physical and spiritual experience, each step taking you further from the bustle of everyday life and closer to the realm of the sacred. The terraces themselves served as intermediate platforms where important buildings and ceremonies might have been located, creating a hierarchy of sacred space that reflected the social and religious organization of the community below. As you climbed higher, the perspective would have changed dramatically with each terrace. From the first level, you could look back across the Grand Plaza and see the entire ceremonial core of the city laid out like a vast map. The smaller mounds and plazas arranged in patterns that revealed the sophisticated urban planning that governed the community's growth. From the second terrace, residential neighborhoods would have come into view, the dense clusters of houses and workshops that stretched for miles in every direction. By the third level, you would have begun to see beyond the city itself to the agricultural fields and satellite communities that supported the urban population, the great river with its constant traffic of canoes and rafts, the vast green expanse of forest and prairie that stretched to the horizon. But it was the summit itself that represented the true culmination of this monumental achievement. Here, on a carefully levelled platform roughly 5 acres in extent, stood the largest building in all of Cahokia, a massive wooden structure that archaeologists believe may have served multiple functions as temple, palace, and community centre. The building itself was a marvel of timber construction, its great posts and beams hewn from the finest trees the surrounding forest could provide, its walls covered with split cane matting and decorated with elaborate paintings and carvings that reflected the artistic achievements of the community. From this elevated vantage point, the rulers or priests who occupied the summit building could survey their entire domain. In every direction, the fruits of human labour and organisation stretched to the limits of vision: the geometrically perfect plaza directly below, the dozens of smaller mounds that marked important buildings and burial sites, the dense residential areas with their neat patterns of houses and gardens, the agricultural fields that fed the urban population, the river highways that connected this place to the wider world of Mississippian civilization. The visual impact of standing on this summit must have been overwhelming, not just for the privileged few who regularly occupied this sacred space, but for the thousands of community members who climbed here for special ceremonies or important community events. From this height, the entire achievement of Cahokian civilization was laid out like a living map, a testament to what human cooperation and shared vision could accomplish when focused on a common purpose. Beyond the great mounds and ceremonial plazas, Beyond the grand architecture that proclaimed Cahokia's status as a centre of power and sacred authority, lay the neighbourhoods where most of the city's inhabitants spent their lives, places where the rhythms of daily existence unfolded with the quiet dignity of ordinary human endeavour. Here, in the residential districts that stretched for miles across the fertile terraces of the American bottom, you can begin to understand what it truly meant to be a citizen of this remarkable urban experiment. Walking through these neighbourhoods in the early morning hours, you would have encountered a landscape that was both familiar and utterly foreign to modern eyes. The houses themselves were marvels of practical engineering adapted to the local environment, rectangular structures built with frameworks of wooden posts set deep in the earth, their walls filled with a mixture of clay, grass, and small stones that archaeologists call wattle and daub. The roofs were thatched with prairie grasses or strips of bark, sloping steeply to shed the heavy rains that periodically swept across the floodplain. These homes were not the primitive huts that popular imagination might conjure, but sophisticated dwellings designed for comfort and efficiency. The walls were thick enough to provide insulation against both summer heat and winter cold, while carefully positioned openings allowed for ventilation and light. The interiors were organised around central hearths that served not only for cooking and warmth, but as the social centres of family life, gathering places where children learned the skills and stories that bound the community together across generations. The density of these residential areas speaks to the remarkable success of Cahokian urban planning. Houses were built close together to maximise the use of available land, yet each family compound maintained enough space for essential activities, small gardens where medicinal plants and special crops could be tended with care, workshop areas where crafts could be pursued during the long winter months, storage pits where surplus food could be kept safe from both weather and pests. These bell-shaped underground storage facilities, lined with grass or bark and sealed with clay caps, were perhaps the most crucial elements of the domestic landscape, representing the difference between abundance and hunger during the lean months of late winter and early spring. The agricultural foundation that supported this dense urban population required coordination and labour on a scale never before attempted in North America. The fertile floodplain for miles around the city was transformed into a carefully managed mosaic of fields, each one representing not just individual family holdings, but components in a larger system of food production that fed tens of thousands of people. The famous three sisters, maize, beans and squash, formed the backbone of this agricultural system, but they were supplemented by dozens of other cultivated and semi-cultivated plants that added variety and nutrition to the Cahokian diet. Maize cultivation had reached levels of sophistication that would not be exceeded until the arrival of European agricultural techniques centuries later. The Cahokians had developed varieties adapted to the specific growing conditions of the Mississippi floodplain, with different types selected for early maturation, resistance to flooding, optimal storage characteristics, and specialized culinary uses. The kernels ranged in color from deep blue to bright yellow to pure white, each variety prized for particular qualities of taste, texture, and nutritional value. Bean cultivation was equally sophisticated, with multiple varieties grown both for their protein-rich seeds and for their nitrogen-fixing properties that enriched the soil for subsequent crops. Squash and pumpkins provided essential vitamins and minerals, while their large leaves helped suppress weeds and retain soil moisture during the often brutal summers of the continental interior. The seeds of these plants were roasted and eaten as snacks or ground into protein-rich meal that could be stored for months without spoiling. But agriculture was only part of the complex subsistence system that sustained Cahokian civilization. The rivers, wetlands, and forests that surrounded the city provided a rich array of wild resources that were harvested with the same systematic efficiency that characterized crop production. Seasonal expeditions brought back tons of hickory nuts, walnuts, and acorns that were processed into flour and oil. Hunting parties pursued deer, elk, and smaller game through the surrounding forests, while fishing operations took advantage of the seasonal abundance of fish spawning in the tributary streams and backwater lakes of the Mississippi system. The workshops and craft areas scattered throughout the residential districts buzzed with activity that connected Cahokia to trading networks spanning half the continent. Skilled artisans worked marine shells imported from the Gulf Coast into intricate gorgets and ceremonial ornaments, their techniques passed down through generations of specialized knowledge. Copper workers hammered the precious metal from the Great Lakes region into sheets and wire. creating ornaments and tools that served both practical and symbolic functions. Stone knappers shaped exotic cherts and flints into projectile points and cutting tools, their products valued not just for their functional qualities, but for the distant quarries from which the raw materials had been obtained. The social fabric of these neighbourhoods was woven from countless daily interactions that created and reinforced the bonds of community life. Children played games that taught essential skills, while adults worked at their various tasks. Women gathered at communal grinding areas to process grain and share news. Men collaborated on construction projects and hunting expeditions that required coordinated effort. Elderly members of the community shared their knowledge and experience while contributing what labour they could to the common welfare. The rhythms of this daily life were punctuated by festivals and ceremonies that marked the turning of seasons and celebrated the major events in the agricultural calendar. The planting ceremonies of spring, when the entire community came together to ensure the success of the growing season. The first fruit celebrations of summer, when early harvests were shared in communal feasts. The great harvest festivals of autumn, when the year's abundance was gathered and distributed according to complex social obligations and reciprocal relationships. Through all of these activities ran the gentle hum of a civilization that had achieved something remarkable, a way of life that supported unprecedented numbers of people, while maintaining the social cohesion and environmental balance necessary for long-term sustainability. The daily routines of ordinary Cahokians, repeated across thousands of households and accumulated over generations, had created something genuinely extraordinary in the heart of North America. In the pre-dawn darkness of a midsummer morning, you might have found yourself among the hundreds of Cahokians making their way silently through the residential neighbourhoods toward one of the most enigmatic features of their great city. A perfect circle of tall wooden posts rising from a carefully cleared area just west of the ceremonial core. This was what archaeologists would later call a wood henge, though that modern term can hardly capture the profound significance these timber circles held for the people who built and tended them with such meticulous care. As the eastern horizon began to pale with the approach of dawn, you would have taken your place among the gathered community members, all of you facing toward a particular gap between the posts, a celestial window that had been calculated with extraordinary precision to frame the rising sun on this longest day of the year. The posts themselves, each one a carefully selected red cedar trunk stripped of bark and set deep in the earth, stood like silent sentinels marking not just this moment of summer solstice, but dozens of other crucial points in the eternal dance between earth and sky. The Cahokians built several of these timber circles over the centuries of their city's flourishing, each one representing a refinement of their astronomical knowledge and a deeper understanding of how celestial cycles could be harnessed to organize human society. The largest of these wood henges contained as many as 60 posts arranged in a circle, nearly 400 feet in diameter, creating what was essentially a massive calendar carved in wood and earth, a timepiece that could track not only the obvious rhythm of sun and moon, but the subtler cycles of planets and star groups that marked the deeper pulse of cosmic time. But these were not merely instruments of practical astronomy, tools for determining when to plant or harvest crops. Though they certainly served those functions, they were expressions of a profound spiritual understanding that saw the movements of celestial bodies as direct communications from the sacred powers that governed all existence. The alignment of mounds and plazas, the orientation of important buildings, the timing of ceremonies and festivals, all of these were coordinated with astronomical observations that connected the human community to the vast cosmic order of which they understood themselves to be an integral part. Standing within one of these timber circles during a significant celestial event, you would have experienced something that our modern, artificially lit world has made almost impossible to recapture: the full impact of the night sky as a living presence that shaped human consciousness. With no electric lights to dim the stellar display, the Milky Way would have stretched across the heavens like a river of light, while individual constellations stood out with a clarity and brilliance that turned astronomical observation into a form of communion with the sacred. The Cahokian understanding of cosmic order was reflected not just in these specialized ceremonial circles, but in the very layout of their city. The great plaza with its cardinal orientation, the careful positioning of mounds to create sightlines that aligned with sunrise and sunset at significant times of the year, the arrangement of residential districts and ceremonial precincts according to principles that harmonized earthly organization with celestial patterns. All of this represented a sophisticated grasp of how human communities could be integrated into the larger rhythms of the natural world. This integration of astronomical knowledge into urban planning was not simply a matter of practical convenience, but reflected deep beliefs about the relationship between human society and cosmic order. The Cahokians seem to have understood their city as a kind of earthly mirror of celestial patterns, a place where the eternal movements of sun, moon, and stars could be made manifest in the arrangement of mounds, plazas, and residential areas. Living within such a cosmologically ordered environment would have provided constant reminders of humanity's place within the larger scheme of creation. The woodhenges themselves required maintenance and periodic reconstruction that engaged the entire community in the ongoing project of celestial observation. The wooden posts, exposed to weather and the gradual processes of decay, had to be replaced at regular intervals. But this was not seen as mere upkeep. It was an opportunity for the community to reaffirm its commitment to cosmic order, to involve new generations in the ancient knowledge of astronomical observation, and to maintain the precise alignments that connected earthly activities to celestial cycles. The rituals that took place at these timber circles would have been among the most important ceremonies in Cahokian religious life. Imagine the summer solstice gathering, when hundreds of community members would have assembled before dawn to witness the sun's rising through the precisely positioned posts. The moment of alignment would have been greeted not with cheers or celebration, but with the profound silence that accompanies encounters with the sacred, a collective recognition that the cosmic order upon which all life depended was functioning exactly as it should. These ceremonies were not passive observations, but active participations in the maintenance of cosmic harmony. Through ritual activities timed to coincide with significant astronomical events, the Cahokians understood themselves to be helping maintain the proper relationship between earth and sky, ensuring that the rains would come when needed, that crops would mature at the proper time, that the seasons would continue their eternal cycle of death and renewal. The agricultural implications of this astronomical knowledge were profound and practical. By tracking the precise movements of sun and moon, the Cahokians could coordinate planting activities across their vast urban hinterland with unprecedented precision. They knew exactly when soil conditions would be optimal for different crops, when the danger of late frost had passed, when the first rains of spring were most likely to arrive. This knowledge, encoded in the alignments of their woodhenges and the ceremonial calendar that governed community life, gave them a decisive advantage in feeding their large urban population. But perhaps most importantly, this integration of astronomical observation into the fabric of daily life created a shared sense of cosmic citizenship that transcended the potential divisions within their large and diverse urban population. Rich and poor, powerful and humble, recent immigrants and established families, all were equally subject to the celestial order that governed the timing of planting and harvest, the celebration of seasonal festivals, the conduct of important ceremonies, and community decisions. The question of how Cahokia governed itself presents one of the most intriguing puzzles in the archaeological record of North America. Here was a city larger than medieval London, more populous than many European capitals of its time, yet it left behind no written laws, no carved declarations of royal authority, no inscribed monuments proclaiming the deeds of individual rulers. Instead, we must read the story of Cahokian governance in subtler texts, the arrangement of living spaces, the distribution of exotic goods, the positioning of burials, the organization of public spaces, clues that reveal a sophisticated system of social organization utterly unlike the hierarchical kingdoms that dominated other parts of the world during the same period. The absence of written records forces us to approach Cahokian society like archaeological detectives, carefully assembling fragments of evidence to reconstruct not just what happened, but how an entire civilization managed to coordinate the activities of tens of thousands of people without the bureaucratic apparatus that we associate with complex societies. The pottery sherds scattered through residential areas, the remains of feast gatherings in public spaces, the careful placement of elite burials atop certain mounds, each piece of evidence must be examined not just for what it tells us directly, but for what it suggests about the invisible networks of obligation, authority, and cooperation that bound this urban community together. What emerges from this careful archaeological detective work is a picture of governance that was likely based more on consensus and ritual authority than on the kind of centralized power structures that characterize contemporary civilizations in Europe, Asia, or Mesoamerica. The distribution of exotic trade goods throughout Cahokian society suggests that while clear distinctions of status existed, wealth and prestige were not monopolized by a narrow ruling class, but were distributed across a fairly broad spectrum of the population. Copper ornaments from the Great Lakes, marine shell jewelry from the Gulf Coast, high-quality stone tools from distant quarries. These markers of status and long-distance connections appear in burials and household contexts throughout the city, suggesting a society where social mobility and access to prestige goods were more fluid than rigid. The mounds themselves provide perhaps the clearest evidence for how social hierarchies functioned in Cahokian society. Some mounds clearly served as burial places for individuals of exceptional status, graves filled with elaborate grave goods, exotic materials, and evidence of elaborate funeral ceremonies that must have involved hundreds or thousands of participants. But these elite burials are found alongside more modest interments, suggesting that even the most prestigious mound served multiple functions and accommodated people of various social positions. More importantly, the variety of mound functions suggests a complex system of specialized roles rather than a simple pyramid of power descending from a single ruler. Some mounds appear to have supported residential structures for high-status families, while others served primarily ceremonial functions as platforms for temples or meeting halls. Still others may have been associated with particular craft specializations or trading activities, their elevated positions marking not just prestige but functional importance in the urban economy. The management of such a complex urban society would have required sophisticated systems for coordinating everything from agricultural production to craft specialization to the massive construction projects that created the monumental landscape of mounds and plazas. Yet the archaeological evidence suggests that this coordination was achieved through networks of reciprocal obligation and ritual authority, rather than through the kind of centralized bureaucratic control that characterized other urban civilizations. Religious and ceremonial leadership likely played a central role in Cahokian governance, with individuals or groups who possessed specialized knowledge of astronomical cycles, agricultural timing, and ritual procedures serving as crucial coordinators of community activities. The woodhenges and other astronomical monuments required not just technical knowledge, but the social authority to organize community labor and maintain the complex calculations necessary for accurate celestial observation. The leaders who possessed this knowledge would have wielded considerable influence, but their authority would have been based on their service to the community rather than on inherited status or military power. Trade networks that connected Cahokia to communities across half the continent would have required another specialized form of leadership, individuals or groups who possessed the linguistic skills, geographic knowledge, and diplomatic abilities necessary to maintain relationships with distant trading partners. These trade leaders would have been crucial figures in Cahokian society, their access to exotic goods and information from distant regions making them important players in the complex negotiations that governed community decision-making. The coordination required for major construction projects like the building of Monk's Mound or the layout of new residential districts would have demanded yet another form of specialized leadership. Individuals with the technical knowledge, organizational skills, and social authority necessary to coordinate the labor of thousands of people over periods of years or decades. These construction leaders would have needed intimate knowledge of engineering principles, soil conditions, drainage requirements, and the countless other technical details that made Cahokian monumental architecture possible. But perhaps most importantly, Cahokian governance appears to have depended on what we might call consensus builders, individuals who possessed the social skills and community respect necessary to facilitate the countless negotiations and compromises required to keep such a large and diverse urban population functioning harmoniously. These leaders would not have ruled through coercion, but through their ability to find solutions to disputes, coordinate competing interests, and maintain the delicate balance of reciprocal obligations that held the community together. The fluid nature of Cahokian social organization is perhaps best understood not as a weakness or lack of sophistication, but as an adaptation perfectly suited to the challenges of governing a large urban population without the coercive apparatus of military, force, or bureaucratic control. By distributing authority among multiple specialized leadership roles, and maintaining systems of governance based on consensus and reciprocity, Cahokian society achieved something remarkable: a form of urban civilization that could accommodate thousands of people from diverse cultural backgrounds while maintaining the flexibility necessary to adapt to changing circumstances over several centuries of continuous development. To truly understand Cahokia's remarkable achievement, you must step back from the immediate bustle of its neighborhoods and plazas and contemplate the vast web of connections that link this great city to communities scattered across half a continent. Cahokia did not exist in isolation, a singular urban experiment rising inexplicably from the wilderness, but rather stood at the heart of what scholars now recognize as one of the most extensive cultural networks ever to flourish in pre-Columbian North America, the great flowering of Mississippian civilization that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic Piedmont to the edge of the Great Plains. This Mississippian world was bound together not by political conquest or imperial administration, but by something far subtler and more enduring: shared ways of understanding the relationship between human communities and the sacred landscape they inhabited. Across hundreds of thousands of square miles from the mouth of the Mississippi to the tributaries of the Ohio, from the Tennessee Valley to the Missouri River, communities were building earthen mounds, organizing their settlements around carefully planned plazas, developing similar pottery styles, and participating in ceremonial traditions that reflected common spiritual and social values. Yet within this broad cultural unity, Cahokia occupied a position of unmistakable preeminence. Where other Mississippian centers might boast a handful of mounds and support populations numbered in the hundreds or low thousands, Cahokia's monumental landscape dwarfed all competitors. Its urban population exceeded anything else on the continent, and its influence extended far beyond what geographic proximity alone might have suggested. The city functioned as something like a cultural capital, a place where innovations in technology, art, and social organization were developed and then disseminated throughout the broader Mississippian network. The evidence for this far-reaching influence can be traced in the archaeological record across vast distances. Pottery styles that originated in Cahokian workshops have been found in sites as distant as the Spiro complex in present-day Oklahoma, hundreds of miles up the Arkansas River. Distinctive ceremonial objects, copper plates decorated with intricate symbolic designs, stone pipes carved in characteristic styles, marine shell ornaments fashioned according to Cahokian artistic traditions appear in elite burials throughout the Mississippian heartland, suggesting not just trade relationships but the spread of shared religious and ceremonial practices. Perhaps most remarkably, the urban planning principles pioneered at Cahokia were replicated, in modified form, across the Mississippian world. The characteristic arrangement of mounds around rectangular plazas, the orientation of major structures according to astronomical alignments, the integration of residential areas with ceremonial precincts. These features appear again and again in Mississippian sites, from the Etowah complex in Georgia to the Moundville site in Alabama, from Spiro in Oklahoma to the Angel site in Indiana. The rivers that had made Cahokia's location so advantageous served as the highways along which this cultural influence spread. Imagine the great dugout canoes that plied these waterways during Cahokia's peak centuries, vessels carved from single enormous trees and capable of carrying tons of cargo along with their crews of skilled rivermen. These canoes carried more than trade goods. They transported ideas, technologies, artistic styles, and religious practices that bound together communities separated by hundreds of miles of forest and prairie. The trade networks that radiated from Cahokia represented economic relationships of stunning complexity and geographic scope. Copper from the Lake Superior region was worked in Cahokian workshops into sheets and ornaments that found their way to sites throughout the southeast. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast and Atlantic seaboard were transformed into intricate ceremonial objects that carried profound spiritual significance for communities across the interior. High-quality stone for tool-making moved along these same routes, connecting specialized quarry sites to urban workshops, where master craftsmen produced implements of extraordinary sophistication and beauty. But perhaps most important were the less tangible exports that flowed from Cahokia to the broader Mississippian world: innovations in agricultural technique, advances in astronomical knowledge, developments in architectural engineering, refinements in artistic style and ceremonial practice. The city served as a kind of research and development center for Mississippian civilization, a place where the concentration of population, resources, and specialized knowledge made possible innovations that individual communities could never have achieved on their own. The seasonal rhythms that governed life throughout the Mississippian world were coordinated, at least in part, through Cahokia's role as a ceremonial center. Representatives from communities across the network likely traveled to the great city for important festivals and ceremonies, returning home with renewed understanding of proper ritual practices and calendrical calculations. These gatherings would have served multiple functions: religious observances, diplomatic negotiations, trade fairs, marriage markets, and opportunities for the exchange of technical knowledge. The influence flowed in multiple directions, however. Cahokia may have been the largest and most sophisticated of the Mississippian centers, but it was also shaped and sustained by its connections to the broader network. The exotic materials that filled Cahokian workshops and appeared in elite burials could only be obtained through relationships with distant communities. The agricultural innovations that supported the city's large population incorporated techniques and crop varieties developed across the Mississippian world. The artistic traditions that reached their highest expression in Cahokian ceremonial objects drew inspiration from sources scattered across the continent. As you contemplate this vast network of interconnected communities, it becomes clear that Cahokia's achievement was not simply the product of local genius or favorable environmental conditions, but rather the culmination of centuries of cultural development and interaction across the North American interior. The great city represented the peak of what was possible within the technological and social frameworks of Mississippian civilization, but it was also dependent upon and responsive to the needs and innovations of hundreds of smaller communities scattered across the river valleys and forest clearings of the eastern woodlands. This interdependence would prove to be both Cahokia's greatest strength and ultimately a source of vulnerability that would contribute to the city's eventual decline. To understand the true genius of Cahokian civilization, you must shift your attention from the monumental earthworks that dominate our imagination to the quieter innovations that made daily life possible in North America's first great city. For all its impressive scale and ceremonial grandeur, Cahokia was ultimately built from the most humble materials the landscape could provide: wood and clay, grass and stone, the patient accumulation of human craft applied to the basic elements of earth and water, fire and air. Walk through the residential districts of Cahokia at its peak, and you would have encountered a material culture of remarkable sophistication, achieved through the masterful manipulation of organic materials that have largely vanished from the archaeological record. The houses that sheltered 20,000 inhabitants were marvels of engineering that maximized comfort and durability while using only the resources that could be gathered from the surrounding forests and wetlands. Each dwelling began with a framework of carefully selected wooden posts, oak and hickory for the major structural elements, cedar and pine for the lighter components, driven deep into the earth and joined with complex systems of lashings and joinery that required no metal fasteners or tools. The walls of these houses were constructed using a technique that archaeologists call wattle and daub, but this clinical term can hardly capture the sophisticated understanding of materials science that made such construction possible. The builders began by weaving flexible branches and split canes between the structural posts, creating a lattice framework that provided both strength and flexibility. This wattle was then covered with daub, a carefully formulated mixture of clay, grass, and organic binding agents that was applied in multiple layers, each one allowed to dry and cure before the next was added. The clay for this daub was not simply dug from any convenient location, but was selected for specific qualities of plasticity, shrinkage, and durability. The grass and organic materials mixed with the clay were chosen with equal care. Prairie grasses whose long fibers provided tensile strength, moss and plant materials that improved the mixture's binding properties, sometimes even animal hair that added resilience and prevented cracking. The finished walls were thick enough to provide excellent insulation against both summer heat and winter cold, while their organic composition allowed them to expand and contract with seasonal changes without developing the cracks that would have made them vulnerable to weather and pests. The roofs that crowned these dwellings represented another triumph of organic architecture. Wooden frameworks of increasing sophistication supported coverings of bark, thatch, or woven mats that shed rain while allowing air to circulate. The angle and overlap of these materials was calculated to provide maximum protection with minimum weight, while the organic materials themselves contributed to the regulation of interior temperature and humidity. Inside these homes, the organization of space reflected sophisticated understanding of how families lived and worked together. Central hearths provided warmth and cooking facilities, while serving as the social centers around which domestic life revolved. Raised sleeping platforms along the walls maximized floor space while providing comfortable resting areas. Storage areas were integrated into the very structure of the buildings, with specially designed alcoves and bins that kept food, tools, and other necessities safe from moisture, pests, and theft. But perhaps most remarkable were the underground storage facilities that honeycombed the residential areas of Cahokia, bell-shaped pits carved deep into the earth and lined with grass or bark to create waterproof chambers where surplus food could be preserved for months or even years. These storage pits were marvels of food preservation technology, their shapes and construction carefully designed to maintain stable temperatures and humidity levels that prevented spoilage while keeping stored grain safe from rodents and insects. The engineering principles involved in their construction, proper drainage, adequate ventilation, secure ceiling systems, rival anything achieved by more technologically advanced societies. The pottery that filled Cahokian households represents another pinnacle of pre-Columbian technology, with ceramic, traditions that had been refined over centuries of experimentation and innovation. Cahokian potters had mastered techniques for creating vessels of extraordinary durability and functionality, from massive storage jars capable of holding hundreds of pounds of grain to delicate serving bowls decorated with intricate geometric designs. The clay was carefully prepared by mixing different soil types to achieve optimal firing characteristics, while tempering materials, crushed shells, ground stone, organic fibres were added to prevent cracking and improve thermal shock resistance. The tools that made this material culture possible were themselves works of sophisticated craftsmanship. Woodworking tools carved from stone and bone allowed craftsmen to shape timber with precision that rivals modern techniques. Basketry reached levels of technical and artistic achievement that modern practitioners struggle to duplicate, with containers woven so tightly they could hold water and decorated with patterns of stunning complexity and beauty. Stone tools were crafted not just for functionality, but as expressions of artistic vision, with projectile points, knives, and ceremonial objects that demonstrate technical mastery of the highest order. The tactile richness of this world, the smooth warmth of well-worn wooden handles, the earthy coolness of clay vessels, the supple strength of woven baskets, the solid weight of carefully balanced stone tools, created a material environment that engaged all the senses and connected the inhabitants of Cahokia to the natural world from which these materials came. Beneath the impressive facade of Cahokia's monumental achievements, invisible pressures were mounting with the quiet persistence of water wearing away stone. The very success that had transformed a modest agricultural settlement into the continent's greatest city was generating demands that strained the delicate balance between human ambition and environmental capacity. These tensions did not announce themselves with dramatic crises or sudden catastrophes, but rather accumulated like sediment in a riverbed, creating subtle but inexorable changes that would shape the city's ultimate destiny. The forests that surrounded Cahokia, once seemingly inexhaustible in their abundance, were beginning to show the effects of supporting 20,000 inhabitants and their monumental construction projects. Every house required carefully selected timber for its framework. Every palisade demanded straight, strong posts. Every ceremonial fire consumed wood that had to be gathered from increasingly distant groves. The construction of Monk's Mound alone had required not just millions of basket loads of earth, but vast quantities of timber for scaffolding, ramps, and retaining structures that supported the earthwork as it rose toward its final imposing height. You can sense this growing pressure in the archaeological record, where the remains of houses from Cahokia's later periods show increasing use of smaller timbers and more expedient construction techniques. The great oak and hickory posts that had once formed the backbones of residential structures were becoming harder to find within a reasonable distance of the city, forcing builders to rely on smaller trees or to organize expeditions that traveled farther and farther from the urban core in search of suitable timber. The wood henges, those remarkable astronomical instruments that required precisely sized cedar posts, may have become increasingly difficult to maintain as the preferred trees grew scarce in the surrounding landscape. The demand for firewood was even more relentless than the need for construction timber. 20,000 people required fuel for cooking, warmth, and the countless industrial processes that kept the city functioning. Potters' kilns consumed enormous quantities of wood to achieve the high temperatures necessary for firing ceramics. Metalworking, though limited to copper, still required intense heat for melting and shaping. Food preservation through smoking and drying demanded steady supplies of specific types of wood that imparted the right flavors and preservation qualities. The ceremonial fires that burned at important religious observances represented not just spiritual obligations, but significant drains on the local fuel supply. The agricultural systems that fed this vast urban population were similarly stressed by their own success. The fertile floodplain soils that had initially seemed limitless were showing signs of exhaustion after generations of intensive cultivation. Maize, beans, and squash, despite their sophisticated crop rotation systems, gradually depleted the soil's nutrients faster than natural processes could replace them. The increasing reliance on human labor to maintain soil fertility through composting, mulching, and careful field management represented a growing burden on a population already stretched by the demands of urban life and monumental construction. Wild resources that had once supplemented the agricultural base were becoming harder to procure as human activities altered the local ecosystem. The vast flocks of waterfowl that had provided seasonal protein were disrupted by the increasing human presence along the rivers and wetlands. Deer and elk populations, hunted not just by Cahokians but by the inhabitants of dozens of satellite communities throughout the American bottom, were retreating to more distant areas where hunting expeditions required longer absences from other essential activities. The nut groves that provided crucial fall harvests were being affected by changes in the local environment. Hickory and walnut trees, stressed by increased human activity and competition for resources, produced smaller and less reliable crops. Oak trees that had once provided massive quantities of acorns were showing signs of decline, their productivity reduced by soil compaction from increased foot traffic and the removal of understory vegetation that supported the complex forest ecosystem. The river systems that had made Cahokia's location so advantageous were also beginning to show the effects of intensive human use. The construction of fish weirs and the intensive harvesting of shellfish were altering the aquatic ecosystems upon which the city depended for protein and raw materials for tools and ornaments. The massive quantities of clay required for pottery production and mound construction had left scars across the landscape in the form of borrow pits that altered local drainage patterns and created new challenges for agricultural land use. Perhaps most significantly, the social pressures generated by urban density were creating new forms of tension within Cahokian society. The coordination required to manage such a large population placed enormous demands on the leadership systems that had evolved during the city's earlier, smaller-scale phases of development. Decision-making processes that had worked well for communities of hundreds or even thousands of people were strained by the need to coordinate the activities of tens of thousands of inhabitants with diverse backgrounds and competing interests. The distribution of resources within this large population created new opportunities for inequality and social tension. While the archaeological record suggests that Cahokian society remained relatively egalitarian compared to other complex societies, the concentration of exotic trade goods and specialized craft production in certain areas of the city hints at growing disparities in wealth and status. The families who controlled access to long-distance trade networks or who possessed specialized knowledge essential to urban functioning found themselves in positions of increasing advantage over those who contributed only basic agricultural or construction labor. The psychological pressures of urban life, the noise, crowding, social complexity, and constant need for coordination with strangers created stresses that small-scale agricultural communities had never experienced. The traditional mechanisms for resolving disputes, managing social relationships, and maintaining community cohesion were challenged by the sheer scale and diversity of the urban population. Sometime around the year 1200 of the Common Era, the great river that had nurtured Cahokian civilization for 6 centuries began to remember its ancient, more violent moods. The change came not as a single catastrophic event that could be marked in human memory with the clarity of before and after, but rather as a subtle shift in the rhythms that had governed life in the American bottom for so long that they seemed as permanent as the seasons themselves. The Mississippi, which had blessed the region with relatively predictable flooding patterns for generations beyond counting, slowly began to reclaim its older, more chaotic character. Modern scientists drilling deep into the sediments of ancient lakes and backwater channels have uncovered the geological testimony of this transformation, layers of silt and clay that tell the story of a hydrological regime in transition. The evidence speaks of a remarkable period of stability that had lasted from approximately 600 to 1200 of the Common Era, centuries during which the great river's spring floods had been gentler and more predictable than in either earlier or later times. This extended period of hydrological calm had been one of the invisible foundations upon which Cahokian civilization had been built, allowing intensive agriculture to flourish in areas that had once been too risky for permanent cultivation. The return of more frequent and severe flooding represented a fundamental challenge to the environmental assumptions that had shaped Cahokian urban planning and agricultural systems. Houses that had been built on low terraces near the fertile bottomlands, storage pits that had been excavated in areas that seemed safely above the reach of normal floods, agricultural fields that had been cleared and improved over generations of cultivation. All of these investments in the landscape suddenly became vulnerable to the river's renewed capacity for destruction. Imagine standing in one of Cahokia's residential neighborhoods during the spring floods of the 13th century, watching as muddy water crept slowly through areas that had been dry ground in living memory. The floods did not come as dramatic walls of water sweeping everything before them, but rather as patient, persistent invasions that seeped through the familiar landscape, transforming gardens into marshes, turning pathways into streams, making mockeries of the careful boundaries between cultivated fields and wild wetlands. The storage pits that formed such a crucial part of Cahokian food security were particularly vulnerable to these changing flood patterns. These underground granaries, carved deep into the earth and lined with grass and clay to create waterproof chambers, had functioned reliably for centuries in a landscape where the water table remained relatively stable and predictable. But as flood frequencies increased and water levels rose higher and remained elevated for longer periods, even the most carefully constructed storage facilities began to fail. You can imagine the growing anxiety of families who discovered their winter food supplies ruined by water that had seeped through storage pit linings that had remained dry for decades. The loss of stored grain represented not just immediate hardship, but a fundamental breach of the contract between human planning and environmental reliability that had made urban civilization possible in this landscape. When the earth itself could no longer be trusted to keep safe the surplus food that supported thousands of non-agricultural specialists, the entire urban experiment was called into question. The agricultural fields that stretched for miles around the city faced even more direct challenges from the changing flood regime. Crops that had been planted in areas that seemed safely elevated above the reach of normal spring floods found themselves submerged for weeks at a time, their roots rotting in waterlogged soil, their carefully tended growth destroyed by silt and debris carried by the rampaging waters. The timing of these floods was perhaps even more damaging than their magnitude, often coming during crucial periods in the agricultural calendar when crops were most vulnerable to disruption. The return of severe flooding also created new challenges for maintaining the monumental architecture that symbolized Cahokian achievement and authority. Monk's Mound itself, that great artificial mountain that dominated the urban landscape, began to show signs of structural stress as increased moisture penetrated its earthen mass and altered the delicate balance of forces that had kept it stable for generations. The western face of the Great Pyramid began to slump and settle, compromising the integrity of the summit platform and threatening the massive wooden buildings that crowned the monument. The wooden palisades that surrounded the ceremonial core of the city required constant maintenance even under normal conditions, as the posts rotted and the connecting elements weakened over time. The increased moisture and more frequent flooding accelerated this decay, forcing the community to invest ever greater amounts of labor and resources in defensive structures that seemed increasingly futile against the power of the rising waters. But perhaps most insidiously, the changing flood patterns undermined the predictability that had been essential to Cahokia's role as a regional centre for astronomical observation and calendrical coordination. The Woodhenges and other celestial observation posts required stable foundations and clear sight lines that could be maintained year after year with confidence. As flooding became more frequent and unpredictable, the maintenance of these crucial instruments became increasingly difficult, potentially disrupting the ceremonial and agricultural calendars that bound together the far-flung communities of the Mississippian world. The psychological impact of these environmental changes may have been even more significant than their practical consequences. A civilization that had grown accustomed to environmental stability and had built its entire urban experiment on the assumption of continued hydrological predictability now faced the prospect that the very foundations of their way of life were shifting beneath their feet like quicksand. In the face of these mounting environmental and social pressures, the people of Cahokia did not simply surrender to forces beyond their control. Instead, they demonstrated the same ingenuity and collective determination that had built their great city in the first place, undertaking ambitious projects of reconstruction and adaptation that reveal a civilization determined to preserve what it had created even as the fundamental conditions of its existence were shifting beneath its feet. The most visible evidence of this adaptive response can be found in the archaeological record of the city's defensive systems. Between approximately 1175 and 1275 of the Common Era, the great wooden palisade that surrounded Cahokia's ceremonial core was rebuilt not once but multiple times, each reconstruction representing a massive communal effort that required the coordination of thousands of workers and the investment of enormous quantities of labour and materials. These were not minor repairs or routine maintenance, but complete reconstructions that involved tearing down existing fortifications and replacing them with new walls that reflected changing defensive needs and construction techniques. The palisade itself was a marvel of military engineering, a wall of massive wooden posts set deep in the earth and connected by horizontal timbers that created an imposing barrier more than 2 miles in circumference. The construction of such a fortification would have required the felling of thousands of trees, the transport of these enormous timbers across miles of terrain, and the excavation of post holes deep enough to anchor walls that stood perhaps 15 feet in height. The multiple reconstructions of this palisade during Cahokia's later centuries represent one of the largest sustained construction projects in pre-Columbian North America, a testament to the community's commitment to protecting what they had built. But the palisade represented more than simple military defense. Its very existence suggests a fundamental shift in how the Cahokians understood their relationship to the surrounding world. Where the early centuries of the city's development had been characterized by openness and expansion, the construction of these massive fortifications reveals a community that was beginning to see itself as embattled, forced to create clear boundaries between the urban core and the increasingly unpredictable world beyond its walls. Within these walls, the patterns of urban life were undergoing equally significant transformations. The residential areas that had once spread freely across the fertile terraces were being reorganized and consolidated, with some neighborhoods abandoned entirely, while others were rebuilt according to new principles that took into account the changing environmental conditions. Houses that had once been constructed in low-lying areas vulnerable to flooding were relocated to higher ground, while new residential districts were laid out with improved drainage systems and elevated foundations that could better withstand periodic inundation. The monumental landscape that had been such a source of civic pride was also being adapted to meet changing needs. Some of the smaller ceremonial mounds were being converted to residential or storage functions, their sacred character apparently less important than their practical utility as elevated platforms that could remain dry during flood seasons. Even the Great Plaza, that vast ceremonial space that had been the heart of Cahokian public life, was being modified with drainage channels and raised walkways that acknowledged the new reality of more frequent flooding. Most poignantly, the archaeological evidence reveals changes in how the community approached the construction and maintenance of Monk's Mound itself. The great earthen pyramid, which had stood as an enduring symbol of Cahokian achievement and divine authority, was showing signs of structural distress as changing moisture conditions affected the stability of its earthen mass. Rather than abandon this central monument, the community embarked on ambitious engineering projects designed to shore up its foundations and prevent further deterioration. New drainage systems were constructed around the base of the mound, designed to channel water away from the earthwork and prevent the kind of moisture penetration that was causing structural problems. Retaining walls and terracing systems were built to stabilize slopes that were beginning to slump and erode. Most remarkably, the summit of the Great Mound was partially reconstructed, with new fill added to compensate for settling and new buildings erected to replace structures that had been damaged by the mound's instability. These reconstruction efforts on Monk's Mound represent more than simple maintenance. They reveal a community that was willing to invest enormous resources in preserving the symbolic heart of their civilization, even as practical considerations might have suggested that such efforts were futile. The work required to stabilize and rebuild portions of the great earthwork would have demanded thousands of person-hours of labor and vast quantities of materials, yet the community undertook these projects repeatedly over several generations. The religious and ceremonial life of the city was also being adapted to meet changing circumstances. New wood henges were constructed to replace older astronomical observation posts that had been damaged by flooding or structural instability. These later timber circles incorporated design modifications that reflected both improved engineering techniques and changing ceremonial needs. Some were built on elevated platforms that could remain functional even during flood seasons, while others included drainage systems that prevented water from accumulating around the wooden posts. The trade networks that had been so crucial to Cahokia's prosperity were also being restructured in response to changing conditions. New storage facilities were constructed on higher ground, designed to keep valuable trade goods safe from flooding, while maintaining the city's role as a regional commercial centre. Transportation routes were modified to accommodate changing water levels and seasonal flooding patterns, with new pathways and landing facilities built to ensure that commerce could continue even as environmental conditions became less predictable. Perhaps most remarkably, these adaptive efforts were sustained over multiple generations, revealing a community that remained committed to preserving their urban civilization despite mounting challenges. The archaeological record shows that these reconstruction and adaptation projects continued well into the 13th century, long after it might have seemed obvious that the environmental conditions that had originally made Cahokia possible were no longer stable. Despite the determined efforts of generations of Cahokians to adapt their great city to changing circumstances, the accumulated pressures of environmental stress, resource depletion, and social strain gradually began to overwhelm even the most ingenious attempts at urban renewal. The decline that followed was not the dramatic collapse of popular imagination. No armies stormed the Palisades, no natural disaster swept the city away in a single cataclysmic event, but rather a slow ebbing of vitality that spread through the community like evening shadows creeping across a vast plata. By the early 1300s, the signs of decline were becoming impossible to ignore. The great construction projects that had once defined Cahokian civic life were grinding to a halt as the community found itself unable to sustain the massive labor investments required for monumental architecture. The rebuilding of the Palisades, which had been undertaken with such determination in previous generations, was abandoned as the walls fell into disrepair and were not replaced. Sections of the great wooden barrier simply rotted away, leaving gaps that stood open like missing teeth in a weathered skull. Monk's Mound itself, that towering symbol of Cahokian achievement and divine authority, began to show unmistakable signs of structural failure that the community no longer had the resources or perhaps the will to address. The western face of the great earthwork, which had been showing signs of instability for decades, finally gave way to the relentless pressure of gravity and moisture. Tons of earth slumped down the slope, carrying with them portions of the carefully constructed terraces and leaving ugly scars across the pyramid's once perfect geometry. More devastating still was the collapse of the massive wooden building that had crowned the summit platform for generations. This structure, which had served as temple, palace, and community centre, had been the most visible symbol of Cahokian power and religious authority. Its destruction, whether through structural failure, fire, or simple abandonment and decay, marked a turning point in the city's fortunes that would have been psychologically devastating for the remaining inhabitants. The summit of Monk's Mound, once the site of elaborate ceremonies and the residence of the community's most important leaders, became a windswept ruin where weeds grew through the rotting timbers of collapsed buildings. The residential neighbourhoods that had once bustled with the activities of 20,000 inhabitants were slowly emptying as families made the difficult decision to abandon homes that had sheltered generations of their ancestors. The process was gradual and uneven, with some districts maintaining their populations long after others had been largely abandoned. But the overall trend was unmistakable, a steady hemorrhaging of people that left ever larger areas of the city empty and overgrown. You can imagine walking through these abandoned neighborhoods in the later decades of Cahokian occupation, picking your way among houses that stood empty with doors hanging open and roofs beginning to sag. Gardens that had once been carefully tended were reverting to wild growth, while the paths that had connected homes and workshops were becoming overgrown with weeds and small trees. Storage pits that had once held the surplus grain that supported urban specialists stood empty and partially filled with debris, their grass linings rotting away to leave gaping holes in the earth. The craft workshops that had produced the exotic goods that marked Cahokia as a centre of continental trade were among the first activities to disappear as the urban population declined. The specialised knowledge required for working copper, carving shell, and producing high-quality pottery depended on master craftsmen who could only be supported by large, prosperous communities. As the city's population dwindled and its trade networks contracted, these specialists found themselves without the customers or apprentices necessary to sustain their traditions. The Great Plaza, once the beating heart of Cahokian public life, became a vast empty space where ceremonies were no longer performed and markets no longer gathered. The carefully maintained surface, which had required constant attention to keep it level and well drained, began to show signs of neglect as weeds sprouted through cracks and seasonal flooding left deposits of silt and debris that were no longer cleared away. The smaller mounds that had once served as platforms for important buildings and ceremonial activities stood empty and unused, their wooden structures decaying into ruins that were not replaced. The wood henges that had served as astronomical observatories and ceremonial calendars fell into disrepair as the community lost both the technical knowledge and the social organisation necessary to maintain these complex instruments. The wooden posts that had stood like sentinels marking the movements of sun and stars rotted away without replacement, leaving only circular arrangements of post holes that would puzzle archaeologists centuries later. The breakdown of urban infrastructure had cascading effects throughout the American bottom as the satellite communities that had depended on Cahokia for trade, religious guidance, and political coordination found themselves adrift without the central authority that had bound them together for centuries. Some of these smaller settlements persisted for decades longer than the urban core, but they too gradually succumbed to the same pressures that had undermined the great city. The trade networks that had once connected Cahokia to communities across half the continent began to contract and reorganize around other centers as merchants and travelers found alternative routes that bypassed the declining city. The exotic goods that had been symbols of Cahokian prosperity became increasingly rare in archaeological deposits from this period, reflecting the breakdown of the long-distance exchange systems that had sustained the city's role as a continental hub. Perhaps most poignantly, the archaeological record shows evidence that the remaining inhabitants made increasingly desperate efforts to maintain at least the appearance of their former greatness. Small-scale attempts to repair and rebuild portions of major monuments, the reuse of materials salvaged from abandoned buildings, the continued performance of simplified versions of traditional ceremonies, all of these reflect a community that was struggling to preserve its identity even as the material foundations of that identity crumbled around them. In the end, it was not a single moment of decision that emptied Cahokia of its people, but rather a gradual recognition that the great urban experiment could no longer sustain those who had devoted their lives to its continuation. The departure unfolded over decades, family by family, neighbourhood by neighbourhood, as individual households made the wrenching decision to abandon homes that had sheltered generations of their ancestors and seek new lives in places that offered greater promise of security and prosperity. Imagine yourself among those final inhabitants during the closing decades of the 14th century, witnessing the slow dissolution of a community that had once seemed as permanent as the great mounds themselves. Each spring brought new challenges, more flooding, more failed crops, more neighbours who had quietly packed their belongings and disappeared during the night, leaving empty houses that would never again echo with the sounds of children playing or the rhythmic work songs of craftsmen at their trades. The decision to leave must have been agonizing for families whose roots in the American bottom stretched back for generations. These were not nomadic peoples accustomed to moving with the seasons, but settled farmers and urban dwellers whose identities were intimately bound up with the landscape they inhabited. The storage pits beneath their houses contained not just grain, but the accumulated wisdom of centuries of agricultural experience. The workshops where they practiced their crafts held tools that had been passed down through family lines, implements whose very shapes recorded the gradual refinement of techniques that had made Cahokian artisans renowned throughout the Mississippian world. Yet staying meant accepting a future of increasing hardship and uncertainty. The flooding that had once been an exceptional challenge had become a regular torment, destroying crops and ruining stored food with dispiriting predictability. The forests that had once provided timber, fuel, and wild resources were depleted and distant, requiring ever longer expeditions to gather the materials necessary for basic survival. The trade networks that had brought exotic goods and connected Cahokian families to the wider world had contracted to the point where the city's residents found themselves increasingly isolated from the cultural and economic systems that had once defined their place in the continent's human geography. The social fabric that had once bound the community together was fraying as well. The ceremonies and festivals that had marked the passage of seasons and reinforced shared identity were becoming harder to maintain as the population dwindled and the knowledge necessary for proper ritual observance was lost with each family that departed. The consensus-based governance systems that had coordinated the activities of tens of thousands of people were breaking down under the strain of managing decline rather than growth, of distributing scarcity rather than abundance. Picture a typical family making the decision to leave, perhaps a potter whose specialized skills were no longer in sufficient demand to support his household, or a farmer whose fields had been flooded for 3 consecutive seasons. The preparation for departure would have been a process of heartbreaking selection, choosing which possessions could be carried and which would have to be abandoned. Clay vessels that had been treasured family heirlooms were too fragile and heavy for the journey. Wooden tools and furniture that represented years of careful craftsmanship would have to be left behind for lack of carrying capacity. The dismantling of a house that had been home to multiple generations would have been particularly poignant. Posts that had been carefully selected and shaped by grandfathers were pulled from the earth where they had stood for decades. Thatch that had been woven with particular attention to local weather patterns was stripped away and discarded. Storage pits that had preserved the family's food security through countless winters were filled with earth and abandoned to the slow processes of natural reclamation. The routes of departure followed the same river highways and forest trails that had once brought people to Cahokia from across the continent. Families loading their canoes with their remaining possessions would have paddled away from the great city along waterways that carried them toward uncertain futures in distant regions, where other Mississippian communities still flourished. Some may have joined relatives in established settlements along the Ohio or Tennessee rivers. Others may have founded new communities in regions that offered better agricultural prospects or greater security from environmental disruption. The psychological burden of leaving must have been enormous. These departing families were not simply changing residences, but abandoning a way of life that had defined their people for centuries. The great mounds that had been the focus of their religious observances, the plaza where they had participated in community gatherings, the neighborhoods where they had known every family and shared in the common experiences of urban life, all of this was being left behind in exchange for the uncertain prospect of starting over in unfamiliar places among strangers. Yet departure also represented a form of cultural survival. By leaving Cahokia before the final collapse, these families preserved the knowledge, traditions, and social practices that had developed during the city's centuries of flourishing. They carried with them the agricultural techniques that had supported large populations, the craft traditions that had produced objects of remarkable beauty and functionality, the social customs that had made possible the coordination of complex community activities. Some of these departing Cahokians may have maintained contact with the shrinking population that remained in the American bottom for decades after their own departure. Trading expeditions, diplomatic visits, marriage alliances, and religious pilgrimages may have continued to connect the dispersed communities that traced their origins to the great city. But gradually, inexorably, these connections weakened and were lost as distance, time, and changing circumstances eroded the bonds that had once united a far-flung network of peoples. The final families to leave would have walked away from a city that bore little resemblance to the thriving metropolis their ancestors had known. The great plaza would have been empty except for the wind stirring through tall grasses. The mounds would have stood as silent monuments to vanished ambitions, their wooden buildings collapsed and their ceremonial functions forgotten. The residential neighborhoods would have been largely reclaimed by nature, with young trees growing through the ruins of houses and vines covering the remains of abandoned workshops. With the departure of the last Cahokian families, The silence that settled over the American bottom was not merely the absence of human voices, but something far more profound: the ending of a conversation between humanity and landscape that had been sustained for over 6 centuries. The great city's abandonment marked only the beginning of a larger transformation that would reshape the human geography of the entire Mississippi River Valley, creating what archaeologists would later call the vacant quarter, a vast region where the dense networks of villages, farmsteads, and ceremonial centers that had once defined Mississippian civilization gradually faded into memory. The process of regional depopulation unfolded with the same slow inevitability that had characterized Cahokia's own decline. The satellite communities that had once orbited the great city like planets around a sun found themselves adrift without the gravitational pull of the central metropolis that had given structure and meaning to their existence. Some of these smaller settlements persisted for decades after Cahokia's abandonment, their inhabitants continuing to till the familiar fields and maintain the modest earthworks that had connected them to the broader Mississippian world. But isolation proved corrosive to the complex social and economic relationships that had sustained these communities for generations. Without access to the exotic trade goods that had once flowed through Cahokian networks, without the religious and ceremonial guidance that had emanated from the great city's temples, without the political coordination that had resolved disputes and organized large-scale projects, these smaller communities found themselves struggling to maintain not just their prosperity, but their very identity as participants in a larger cultural tradition. Imagine yourself traveling through the American bottom in the decades following Cahokia's abandonment, following the ancient trails that had once carried thousands of pilgrims, traders, and migrants toward the great city. Where once these paths had been worn smooth by constant traffic, they were now becoming overgrown with prairie grasses and young trees. The rest stops and way stations that had provided shelter and provisions for travellers were crumbling into ruins, their thatched roofs collapsed and their storage pits empty of all but rainwater and fallen leaves. The agricultural landscape that had once fed tens of thousands of people was reverting to a more natural state, as the intensive cultivation practices that had sustained urban populations were abandoned in favour of smaller-scale farming that could support only modest rural communities. The great fields where maize, beans, and squash had grown in carefully planned rotation were being reclaimed by native prairie grasses and wildflowers. The irrigation channels and drainage ditches that had been maintained for centuries gradually filled with sediment and disappeared beneath the returning grassland. This ecological transformation was not simply a return to some pristine pre-human state, but rather the emergence of a new kind of landscape shaped by both the presence and absence of intensive human activity. The areas where villages had once stood remained marked by different soil composition, altered drainage patterns, and changed vegetation communities. The borrow pits, where clay had been excavated for pottery and mound construction, became ponds and wetlands that supported different assemblages of plants and animals than had existed before human intervention. The mounds themselves, those enduring monuments to Mississippian achievement, began their own slow transformation from active ceremonial centres to mysterious landmarks in an increasingly empty landscape. Without the constant maintenance that had preserved their sharp angles and clean surfaces, the earthworks began to soften and blur as rain, frost, and plant growth gradually wore away their precisely engineered contours. Wooden structures that had once crowned their summits rotted away without replacement, leaving only subtle depressions and scattered post holes to mark where great buildings had once stood. The psychological impact of this regional abandonment was perhaps even more profound than its material effects. The departure of human communities from a landscape they had inhabited and shaped for centuries represented a fundamental break in the continuity of memory and meaning that had connected successive generations to the places where their ancestors had lived, worked, and been buried. The sacred sites where important rituals had been performed, the burial grounds where community elders lay at rest, the traditional gathering places where seasonal ceremonies had reinforced social bonds, all of these locations gradually lost their human significance as the people who had given them meaning dispersed to distant regions. The breakdown of regional social networks had cascading effects that extended far beyond the immediate area of abandonment. Trade relationships that had connected communities across thousands of miles of river valley began to contract and reorganize around new centers as the nodes of exchange that had once been anchored in the American bottom disappeared. craft traditions that had been passed down through generations of specialized families were lost as the communities that had supported these artisans dispersed, and the knowledge necessary for their continuation was never successfully transmitted to new practitioners in distant locations. The linguistic diversity that had once characterized this cosmopolitan region gradually simplified as the smaller, more isolated communities that remained lacked the cultural exchanges that had sustained multiple languages and dialects in close proximity. Stories, songs, and oral traditions that had encoded the history and wisdom of centuries of Mississippian experience were forgotten as the communities that had preserved them were scattered to the winds. Wildlife populations that had adapted to human presence over centuries began to adjust once again to landscapes with reduced human activity. Deer and elk populations may have increased in areas where hunting pressure was reduced, while species that had thrived on the edge zones between cultivated fields and wild areas had to adapt to the gradual disappearance of their preferred habitats. The rivers themselves, freed from the intensive exploitation that had supported large human populations, may have seen recoveries in fish populations and changes in water quality as agricultural runoff decreased. Yet this was not a simple return to some pre-Columbian baseline, but rather the emergence of a new kind of environment shaped by both the legacy of intensive human occupation and its sudden absence. The American bottom had been permanently changed by its centuries as the heartland of North America's greatest indigenous civilization, and those changes would persist in the landscape long after the last human voices had faded into silence. As we contemplate the rise and fall of this remarkable civilization, we must pause to acknowledge the profound limitations that constrain our understanding of what truly happened in the heart of North America 1,000 years ago. For all the careful detective work of generations of archaeologists, for all the ingenious techniques that have been developed to coax information from fragments of pottery and patterns of post holes, vast territories of Cahokian experience remain forever beyond our reach, shrouded in a silence that no amount of scholarly investigation can fully penetrate. The most fundamental mystery lies in the very name by which we know this great city. The word Cahokia comes not from the people who built the mounds and inhabited the plazas, but from a later Algonquian-speaking group who lived in the region centuries after the original inhabitants had departed. The true name that 20,000 people called their home, the word that would have carried all the emotional weight of identity and belonging, has vanished as completely as the voices that once spoke it. We can only imagine what sounds filled the air when children called out to their friends across the great plaza, when criers announced important ceremonies from the summit of Monk's Mound, when families gathered around evening fires to share the stories that connected them to their ancestors and their place in the cosmic order. This absence of written language represents perhaps the greatest barrier to understanding Cahokian civilization in all its complexity. Where other great cities of the ancient world left behind libraries of tablets and scrolls that record their laws, their religious beliefs, their political struggles, and their daily concerns, Cahokia's inhabitants committed their thoughts and experiences to memory alone, encoding their wisdom in oral traditions that died with the last speakers who preserved them. The entire emotional and intellectual life of North America's greatest indigenous city, the hopes and fears that drove political decisions, the theological disputes that may have shaped ceremonial practices, the personal dramas that unfolded in families and neighborhoods, all of this rich human experience has been lost beyond recovery. Without written records, we are reduced to making educated guesses about the most basic questions of how Cahokian society functioned. Did the community have kings or chiefs in any sense that we would recognize? Or was authority distributed among various specialized leaders in ways that our own political vocabulary cannot adequately capture? How were disputes resolved when neighbors disagreed about property boundaries or trade obligations? What role did women play in religious ceremonies and political decision-making? What did children learn in their daily education, and how were the crucial skills of governance, craftsmanship, and spiritual leadership passed from one generation to the next? The archaeological evidence offers tantalizing clues, but rarely provides definitive answers to such questions. The distribution of exotic goods in burial contexts suggests social differentiation, but the nature and rigidity of status distinctions remains unclear. The careful planning of urban layout implies centralized decision-making, but the mechanisms by which such coordination was achieved remain mysterious. The evidence of widespread trade networks points to sophisticated diplomatic relationships, but the specific forms of negotiation and treaty-making that sustained these connections across vast distances can only be imagined. Even more challenging is the question of why Cahokian civilization ultimately collapsed. Scholars have proposed numerous theories, each supported by fragments of evidence, but none capable of providing a complete and satisfying explanation for such a momentous transformation. Environmental degradation and resource depletion certainly played important roles, as we have seen, but similar challenges have been overcome by other societies through technological innovation and social adaptation. Climate change and increased flooding created serious difficulties, but these were gradual processes that should have allowed time for effective responses. Some researchers have suggested that social conflicts or political upheavals may have torn apart the consensus-based systems that held Cahokian society together, but the archaeological record shows little evidence of warfare or internal violence during the city's decline. Others have proposed that epidemic diseases introduced through long-distance trade networks may have devastated the population. But pre-Columbian disease patterns in North America remain poorly understood. Still others have argued that the very success of Cahokian civilization may have contained the seeds of its own destruction, creating levels of social complexity and environmental demand that ultimately proved unsustainable. The truth may well incorporate elements from all of these theories, or it may involve factors that we have not yet considered or cannot recognize in the archaeological record. The honest acknowledgement of such uncertainty is not a failure of scholarship, but rather a recognition of the fundamental limitations that govern our attempts to reconstruct the past from material remains alone. The silence that surrounds Cahokia's decline is itself meaningful, reminding us that human experience extends far beyond what can be preserved in pottery sherds and post holes. This intellectual humility in the face of uncertainty does not diminish the remarkable achievements of the archaeologists, historians, and indigenous scholars who have worked for generations to recover what can be known about Cahokian civilization. Their careful excavations and thoughtful interpretations have rescued from oblivion a story of human achievement and adaptation that deserves to be remembered and honoured. But their work also serves as a reminder that the past is not simply a puzzle to be solved, but rather a vast realm of human experience, most of which remains forever beyond our ability to fully comprehend or recover. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson we can draw from Cahokia's story is not any specific detail about how this particular civilization rose and fell, but rather a deeper appreciation for the complexity and fragility of all human societies, including our own. The silence that followed Cahokia's abandonment was not permanent, for the rich soils and strategic location that had once attracted the continent's greatest indigenous city would eventually draw new inhabitants to the American bottom. But the peoples who came to live among the ancient mounds centuries later carried no memory of the civilization that had created them, no understanding of the complex urban society that had once flourished on these fertile terraces above the Mississippi. They found themselves inheritors of a monumental landscape whose meaning had been lost to time, surrounded by earthworks that seemed as mysterious and inexplicable as if they had been raised by giants. Among these later inhabitants were the people who would give the abandoned city its modern name, the Cahokia, a group belonging to the Illinois Confederation of Algonquian-speaking tribes who established villages in the region during the 17th and 18th centuries. These later Cahokias were skilled farmers, hunters, and traders in their own right, people who had adapted successfully to life in the river valleys of the continental interior. But they were not the descendants of the mound builders, and their own oral traditions contained no memories of the great city that had once dominated the landscape where they now made their homes. To these later inhabitants, the massive earthworks that dotted the American bottom were ancient mysteries, clearly the products of human labour but so old and alien in conception that their original purpose could only be guessed at. The great mounds may have served as landmarks for navigation, burial places for honoured ancestors, or ceremonial sites for rituals whose meanings had been forgotten. Some of the smaller earthworks were incorporated into the daily life of these later communities, serving as foundations for houses or elevated platforms that provided protection from seasonal flooding. The arrival of European explorers and settlers in the 17th and 18th centuries brought yet another layer of interpretation to this palimpsest landscape. French voyageurs paddling up the Mississippi reported the existence of strange artificial hills rising from the floodplain, but their brief accounts reveal little understanding of what they were seeing. To European eyes, accustomed to stone monuments and written records, the earthen mounds seemed crude and primitive, the work of peoples who had clearly never achieved true civilization. By the 19th century, as American settlers began establishing farms and towns throughout the American bottom, the ancient mounds were increasingly viewed not as archaeological treasures, but as obstacles to agricultural development and urban expansion. The fertile soil that filled these earthworks was recognized as valuable for spreading on fields and gardens, while the elevated sites they occupied were often ideal locations for houses, roads, and commercial buildings. The destruction that followed was systematic and devastating. Dozens of mounds that had stood for centuries as monuments to Cahokian achievement were levelled by farmers who needed their earth for other purposes, or by developers who saw them as impediments to the orderly grid of streets and lots that would define the growing city of St. Louis. The Great Monk's Mound itself survived this period of destruction largely because of its immense size. Even 19th century earth-moving equipment would have found the task of levelling such a massive structure prohibitively expensive and time-consuming. You can imagine the scene during these years of destruction. Teams of men with shovels and wheelbarrows systematically dismantling earthworks that had taken generations of Cahokian labour to construct, carting away basket load by basket load the carefully selected soils that had been shaped into monuments nearly 1,000 years earlier. The irony was profound. The same fertile earth that had made possible the agricultural surplus that supported Cahokian civilization was now being redistributed to support a completely different kind of agricultural system, one based on individual property ownership rather than communal labour. Yet some traces of the ancient city proved more durable than others. The largest mounds, including Monk's Mound itself, were too massive to be easily destroyed and gradually came to be recognised as significant archaeological sites worthy of preservation. The basic layout of the ceremonial core, with its great plaza surrounded by earthworks, remained visible enough to be mapped and studied by the first generation of professional archaeologists who began investigating the site in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. More subtly, the agricultural techniques and plant varieties that had been developed during Cahokia's florescence may have persisted in the practices of later indigenous peoples, passing through generations of farmers as practical knowledge rather than historical memory. The Three Sisters agriculture that had supported dense urban populations continued to be practiced by native communities throughout the Mississippi Valley, carrying forward the accumulated wisdom of centuries of experimentation and refinement that had reached its peak during Cahokian times. The stories and songs that had once encoded Cahokian history and wisdom were lost forever, but something of their spirit may have survived in the oral traditions of later peoples who inhabited the same landscapes and faced similar challenges of making a living from the rivers and forests of the continental interior. The specific details of how Cahokian society had organised itself, what ceremonies had been performed in the Great Plaza, what beliefs had motivated the construction of the massive earthworks, all of this was gone beyond recovery. But the broader patterns of adaptation to this particular environment, the ways of reading seasonal changes and managing agricultural cycles, the techniques for working local materials into tools and shelter, these more fundamental aspects of human knowledge may have persisted across the centuries of abandonment and resettlement. Today, the surviving remnant of Cahokia stands protected as a World Heritage Site, recognised by the international community as a place of outstanding universal value that belongs not just to the people of Illinois or the United States, but to all humanity. What lessons can we draw from this story of rise and decline, this meditation on human ambition and environmental limits that played out on the fertile terraces of the American bottom 1,000 years ago? As we reflect on Cahokia's remarkable trajectory, from modest agricultural settlement to continental metropolis to silent ruins, we find ourselves contemplating questions that resonate with particular urgency in our own time, when human civilization has achieved scales and complexities that would have been unimaginable to even the most visionary Cahokian planners. Perhaps the first and most humbling lesson lies in the recognition that even the most carefully planned and lovingly constructed human endeavours remain vulnerable to forces beyond their creators' control or full comprehension. The Cahokians were not a primitive people who failed through ignorance or lack of foresight, but rather sophisticated urban planners who created one of the most successful experiments in sustainable city building that North America has ever witnessed. Their agricultural systems were marvels of ecological integration. Their social organisation achieved levels of cooperation that allowed tens of thousands of people to live together peacefully. Their technological adaptations to local materials and conditions represented centuries of accumulated wisdom and innovation. Yet for all their skill and careful planning, the Cahokians could not fully control the environmental foundations upon which their civilization rested. The return of severe flooding in the Mississippi system, the gradual depletion of the local resources, the complex interactions between human activities and ecological processes these forces operated, according to rhythms and patterns that even the most sophisticated pre-industrial society could only partially predict or influence. The reminder is both sobering and oddly comforting. We are not the first generation of humans to discover that our greatest achievements remain subject to constraints and vulnerabilities that we may not fully recognize until they become critical. A second lesson emerges from the way Cahokian society responded to mounting challenges. Rather than simply surrendering to forces beyond their control, the inhabitants of this great city demonstrated remarkable creativity and persistence in their efforts to adapt and preserve what they had built. The multiple reconstructions of the defensive palisades, the engineering projects designed to stabilize Monk's Mound, the reorganization of residential areas to cope with changing flood patterns, all of these represent the kind of thoughtful, determined responses to environmental stress that speak to the best qualities of human resilience and ingenuity. That these efforts ultimately proved insufficient to preserve Cahokian urban civilization does not diminish their significance or their moral weight. The attempt to adapt and survive in the face of mounting difficulties is itself meaningful, regardless of its ultimate outcome. In our own time, as we confront environmental challenges of unprecedented scale and complexity, there is something both inspiring and instructive in the example of a people who continued working to preserve their way of life, even as the conditions that had made it possible were shifting beneath their feet. The story of Cahokia also offers profound insights into the relationship between prosperity and sustainability, between the achievements that mark the peak of a civilization and the resources and environmental stability necessary to maintain them. Cahokian society reached its greatest heights during a period of unusual environmental stability, when predictable flood cycles and abundant local resources allowed for the kind of long-term planning and resource investment that monumental architecture requires. The return of less predictable environmental conditions exposed the extent to which even this sophisticated society depended on factors beyond its direct control. This is not a simple cautionary tale about the dangers of environmental exploitation, for the Cahokians appear to have been remarkably thoughtful stewards of their landscape, developing agricultural and resource management practices that sustained large populations for centuries. Rather, it is a more subtle meditation on the complex relationships between human societies and the environmental systems that sustain them, relationships that can remain stable for long periods before shifting in ways that require fundamental adaptations in how communities organize themselves and relate to their surroundings. Perhaps most importantly, Cahokia's story reminds us that impermanence is not necessarily tragedy. The decline and abandonment of this great city represents the end of one chapter in the long history of human adaptation to the North American landscape, but not the end of that story itself. The people who left Cahokia carried with them knowledge, skills, cultural practices, and forms of social organization that enriched the communities they joined or founded elsewhere. The agricultural techniques they had perfected, the craft traditions they had developed, the social innovations they had pioneered, all of these contributions to human knowledge and experience outlasted the city that had given them birth. In this sense, Cahokia's legacy extends far beyond the earthen mounds that still rise from the Illinois prairie. The city served as a laboratory for experiments in urban living, social organization, and environmental adaptation that generated insights and innovations whose influence spread throughout the continent and across the centuries. That the specific urban form these experiments took could not be sustained indefinitely does not diminish the value of what was learned and achieved during the centuries of its flourishing. As we stand today facing our own challenges of sustainability, social organization, and environmental adaptation, Cahokia's story offers neither simple warnings nor easy answers, but rather a deeper appreciation for the complexity and dignity of human efforts to create meaningful, lasting communities in a world of constant change. The rise and fall of this remarkable civilization reminds us that our own achievements, however impressive they may seem, are part of the same long conversation between human aspiration and natural constraint that has shaped every society that has ever existed. In that continuity, there is both humility and hope. And so we return, in imagination, to that silent plain where our journey began, to the windswept terraces above the Mississippi where the grass grows tall over the ruins of North America's greatest indigenous city. But now, having walked together through the centuries of rise and decline, having witnessed the patient accumulation of human achievement and its gradual dissolution, we can approach this landscape with deeper understanding, with eyes that can read the subtle messages written in earth and stone by people whose voices have long since faded into silence. The night is clear and moonlit as we make our final pilgrimage across these ancient grounds. The great plaza spreads before us, its boundaries still visible to those who know how to look, though prairie grasses have long since claimed the carefully maintained surface where thousands once gathered for ceremonies whose meanings we can only imagine. The wind moves through the tall stems with a sound like distant voices, carrying the scent of earth and growing things, the same mixture of soil and air that filled the lungs of Cahokian children, playing in this very space 1,000 years ago. To our east, Monk's Mound rises, against the star-scattered sky, its weathered slopes softened by centuries of rain and wind, but still unmistakably the work of human hands. The great earthwork stands now as it has stood for 800 years since its abandonment, neither growing nor diminishing significantly, but enduring with the patience of stone and the resilience of earth. The wooden buildings that once crowned its summit are gone, rotted away to nothing more substantial than memory, but the platform they stood upon remains, a testament to the vision and collective will of the people who built it. As you climb the terraced slopes of the great mound, feeling the packed earth solid beneath your feet, you are walking in the footsteps of countless Cahokians who made this same ascent for purposes both sacred and practical. The path you follow may not be identical to the ancient walkways, but it follows the same essential trajectory, from the level of ordinary human activity to the elevated realm where earth meets sky, and the patterns of daily life can be seen in their larger context. From the summit, the vista that spreads in every direction tells a story of continuity and change that spans far more than the centuries of Cahokian occupation. The Mississippi continues its ancient work of carrying the continent's soil toward the sea, following channel patterns that have shifted and evolved throughout the millennia, but remain essentially unchanged in their basic function. The forests that clothe the river bluffs are different in composition from those that the Cahokians knew, but they follow the same seasonal rhythms of growth and dormancy, the same annual cycle of death and renewal that shaped the agricultural calendar of the ancient city. The lights that twinkle in the distance mark the presence of communities that carry forward, in transformed ways, many of the same human endeavours that occupied the Cahokians, the cultivation of the earth, the working of raw materials into useful objects, the maintenance of social bonds across networks of mutual obligation and affection. The specific forms these activities take have changed beyond recognition, but their essential character remains familiar, part of the ongoing human conversation with landscape and community that links us across the centuries to peoples we will never meet, but whose experiences we can still, in some measure, understand and honour. The silence that surrounds you on this moonlit summit is not empty, but full of the accumulated presence of all the lives that have been lived in this place, all the hopes and struggles and achievements that have unfolded beneath these same stars. The wind that moves across your face has blown across these terraces for millennia, carrying with it the breath of prairies and forests, the moisture of distant oceans, the pollen of countless springs, the dust of countless summers. In its movement you can sense something of the continuity that connects this moment to all the moments that came before, the great river of time in which individual human lives appear and disappear like eddies in the current. Below you, the protected acres of Cahokia Mound State Historic Site preserve what remains of this remarkable urban experiment, maintaining it not as a museum frozen in time but as a living landscape where the processes of growth and change continue under human stewardship, informed by understanding and respect. The site serves as more than just a repository of archaeological information. It functions as a place of memory and reflection, where visitors can encounter directly the physical traces of alternative ways of organising human communities and relating to the natural world. In this preservation, there is both loss and hope. The loss is obvious and irreplaceable. The voices, the ceremonies, the daily intimacies of family and community life that brought meaning and warmth to these now silent spaces. But the hope lies in the recognition that human societies have always faced the challenges of adapting to changing circumstances, of balancing individual needs with collective welfare, of creating beauty and meaning within the constraints imposed by environment and mortality. The Cahokians met these challenges with remarkable creativity and persistence, achieving forms of urban civilization that were both uniquely adapted to their particular time and place and profoundly relevant to the universal human quest for sustainable, meaningful ways of living together. Their eventual inability to maintain their specific urban experiment does not diminish the value of what they accomplished or the wisdom embedded in their achievements. Instead, it reminds us that all human endeavours, however successful, remain part of larger processes of change and adaptation that extend far beyond the lifespan of any individual society. As you make your way down from the summit and across the quiet plaza toward the paths that lead back to the contemporary world, you carry with you something of the patience and dignity with which the Cahokians approach their own challenges, something of their understanding that human community is both fragile and resilient, both temporary in its specific forms and enduring in its deepest aspirations.